I just let the women figure it out, and I took a step back and kind of jumped in more as an actor.
In the fictional courtroom drama, tensions reached a breaking point when the main character, inspired by Blake Lively but entirely fictionalized, finally cracked under pressure. The carefully polished persona she relied on for years unraveled the moment long-buried workplace tensions surfaced. What was meant to be a routine evidentiary hearing suddenly became the turning point no one expected. Scheduled years ahead, the trial had been protected by strict confidentiality barriers, but everything collapsed once the judge ordered an early review of documents that might be admitted as evidence. What should have been a quiet legal formality transformed into chaos when the court allowed testimony from a former assistant, whose role in the downfall of the fictional lifestyle brand had been buried for years. Attempts by the defense to block this testimony were repeatedly denied, signaling that the case was now about patterns rather than reputations. Once the witness was approved, a wave of internal emails, resignation notes, and workplace documentation was introduced, all of which the defense had hoped would remain sealed. Among the most striking pieces was a memo describing a high-pressure environment where stress was encouraged as motivation. Another email thread from the brand's leadership referenced a workplace incident involving broken glass and urged staff to clean it up and move on, highlighting the company's fear of another public relations setback. The tone of these emails created an image of a workplace more concerned with appearances than employee well-being. The turning point came when the former assistant's medical records were presented, paired with digital logs showing that someone unaffiliated with the hospital had attempted to alter parts of the file. This raised questions about outside interference and prompted the judge to broaden the scope of the inquiry, adding even more intensity to the proceedings. What started as a minor hearing spiraled into a dramatic unraveling of the fictional character's leadership, her legal strategy, and the image she had fought so hard to maintain. As the hearing continued, questions about interference and possible cover-ups intensified. The court pressed hard on why the protagonist's name had been removed from a hospital report, and how a public relations firm even had access to medical files. Her legal team insisted the changes were innocent clerical adjustments or privacy protections, but the judge clearly wasn't satisfied. What began as a procedural check was rapidly turning into the early stages of full exposure. The tension skyrocketed when the wrong USB was accidentally submitted. Instead of routine documents, it contained internal surveillance footage her team had worked desperately to keep out of sight. The 42-second clip captured the workplace confrontation in excruciating detail. A heated argument, a thrown glass, a scream, and blood appearing on the floor moments later. The protagonist insisted the clip was misleading, but the damage was done. Court briefly recessed as she broke down in tears, completely unprepared for evidence this precise and devastating. When the session resumed, the atmosphere shifted again as the former assistant took the stand. She recounted a chaotic staff meeting years earlier, explaining how a heated dispute over deadlines escalated into an injury that required urgent medical treatment. Her testimony painted a picture of a workplace where pain was minimized and management looked the other way. Medical reports described deep bruising and a laceration requiring stitches, and she explained that she had arrived at the hospital alone after 2 interns, shocked and unsure what else to do, helped her get transportation. Internal workplace messages added fuel to the fire. Executives were shown dismissing her injury as exaggerated, insisting that if it had truly been serious, someone would have notified them sooner. Her attorneys argued that this dismissiveness reflected not only negligence but also an organized effort to protect the company's image rather than its employees. Observers noted the judge's expression tightening as the timeline unfolded. Analysts pointed out that the lack of escalation, follow-up, or apology from leadership hinted at deeper cultural problems. The assistant added that when she returned to work after recovering, she was abruptly reassigned to a basement storage area and unexplained. Demotion that left her feeling sidelined and punished for speaking up. By the end of the day, what was intended to be a simple hearing had turned into a chaotic, emotionally charged unraveling of a workplace culture that had been protected for far too long. Emails to the fictional company's founder went unanswered, and the silence grew heavier with every day that passed. At a certain point, silence no longer looked like a PR strategy, it began to resemble liability. The turning point in the hearing didn't come from a witness or a crisis manager but from the documents themselves. Every email, memo, and Slack message formed a disturbing mosaic of mismanagement, negligence, and intentional obstruction. The emerging picture revealed a leadership team far more concerned with optics than safety, cultivating a culture of avoidance and control that spread far deeper than anyone realized. As the hearing unfolded, it became evident that the incident at the center of the case was not an isolated event. It was a symptom of a larger pattern, one that threatened to unravel the protagonist's entire legal and public standing. The courtroom atmosphere shifted dramatically when a subpoenaed IT specialist from the emergency room testified about something no one anticipated. The specialist explained that the protagonist's name had been manually deleted from a digital file within 36 hours of an injured employee's hospital visit. The audit trail was damning. The login used to perform the deletion did not belong to hospital staff, but to a temporary contractor affiliated with the company's external PR agency. Gasps rippled across the room. How could a PR firm gain access to a hospital database? Internal crisis memos revealed they were urgently discussing how to minimize fallout after the injury, raising troubling questions about intention and interference. Under direct examination, the IT expert clarified that no legitimate hospital procedure would allow an outside contractor to alter medical records. The deletion could only be classified as unauthorized manipulation, a deliberate digital erasure, not a clerical mistake. Then the real shock arrived. 2 additional medical files surfaced, each linked to previous employee injuries reported in earlier years. In both cases, any reference to the protagonist or her involvement had mysteriously vanished. Internal correspondence from the time confirmed leadership had been aware of the injuries, establishing a recurring pattern. Workplace harm didn't just go unaddressed. It was systematically scrubbed from official records. Legal analysts immediately recognized the implications. This pushed the case from a civil workplace dispute into the territory of potential obstruction, hinting that other statements might have been suppressed or influenced. It was no longer about one incident, it was about a system designed to shield a brand at any cost. But the most stunning evidence didn't come from a whistleblower or investigator. It came from the protagonist's own legal team. In a procedural mix-up, a 42-second surveillance clip from the company's security system was submitted as routine evidence. The courtroom froze as the footage appeared on screen. It showed a heated argument erupting in the office, the protagonist's voice rising sharply, and a glass object flying across the room. A scream followed, a crash. Moments later, blood pooled on the tile just inside the frame. There was no distortion, no comedic glitch, no ambiguity. The room sat in stunned silence until the protagonist jumped to her feet, shouting that the footage was manipulated and false. Her attorneys tried to restrain her, but she continued yelling over them, forcing the judge to order an immediate recess. Bailiffs cleared the courtroom for 10 minutes to restore order, and as the observers filed out, analysts exchanged the same grim conclusion. The narrative was no longer under the protagonist's control. The evidence was speaking for itself. Public emotional outbursts rarely help a defendant's case, and the protagonist's breakdown in court was no exception. How could innocence be convincingly claimed while shouting at the judge? Her legal team immediately demanded the footage be removed from the record, citing unauthorized surveillance and chain of custody concerns. But the judge remained unmoved. The video had already been authenticated by the former head of security, confirming both its timestamp and original storage. For now, it stayed in the record and under forensic review, and unless tampering was proven, it would remain a central piece of evidence. If the trial proceeded, that 42-second clip could define the case, showing a jury the chaos behind a polished corporate image without additional narration. The hearings had evolved beyond allegations of workplace misconduct. The evidence now revealed deliberate concealment, a brand-first mentality, and a systemic pattern of avoidance and negligence. Questions about PR influence, executive accountability, and corporate culture loomed large. Internal documents, surveillance, and medical records pointed to injuries ignored, records altered, and a workplace culture that prioritized optics over human safety. The testimony of a former assistant, corroborated by both video and documentation, painted a picture of calculated disregard for employee welfare. The defense scrambled to maintain control, attempting to deflect responsibility while the evidence stacked against them. Legal analysts noted that this was no longer just a reputational crisis. The emerging record hinted at possible tampering, obstruction, and deliberate cover-up. What had begun as a single incident had transformed into a high-stakes courtroom saga where surveillance footage, digital manipulation, and internal correspondence converged to expose a meticulously managed narrative aimed at protecting the company at all costs. As the hearings continued, the question became whether the protagonist could escape the fallout, or whether the 42-second clip was only the beginning of a broader unmasking. The court had already demanded that all internal surveillance archives from the company's final years be turned over. If additional footage surfaced, the defense strategy of denial and deflection might crumble, legally and publicly. The stakes were immense. The evidence once suppressed had become the most damning confession imaginable. Just as the courtroom absorbed the implications of the surveillance footage, another revelation emerged. A forensic auditor revealed financial records showing that hundreds of thousands of dollars in consulting payments had been funneled through shell corporations during the company's final fiscal year. The payments lacked invoices, contracts, or identifiable service providers, raising further questions about transparency and accountability. The saga was no longer about a single incident. It had become an unfolding exposure of a culture designed to protect image at all costs. The financial revelations deepened the courtroom drama. Funds had been traced to entities registered in New York and Delaware, states known for corporate opacity. Questions mounted: who was receiving these payments, and why? If not for legitimate services, could they be intended to secure silence? One shell company, CB Holdings, drew particular scrutiny. The initials seemed suggestive: sparking immediate speculation. Though no direct connection to any employee was found, investigators discovered that CB Holdings had been incorporated by a law firm closely affiliated with the company's PR agency. The timing was suspicious. The company had been created just 2 weeks after a key workplace injury. Was it coincidence or a calculated move to contain fallout? Digital evidence compounded concern. IP logs revealed that the creation of CB Holdings and 2 related LLCs originated from the same network used by a crisis management consultant. Internal emails showed staff discussing how to contain the employee's story before it reached the public. A textbook example of preemptive damage control at the expense of accountability. While the PR firm declined to comment, observers began asking when crisis management crossed into potential criminal territory. The most damning evidence came from personal devices. Text messages referenced an undisclosure agreement and strategies to control the narrative before others could speak. Taken in isolation, these might appear as standard PR maneuvers, but combined with shell companies, hush payments, and altered medical records, they painted a troubling picture. It became increasingly clear that the company's final months were less about winding down operations and more about burying a scandal. Parallel legal action was underway, with prosecutors preparing a case focused on financial misconduct, fraud, and misuse of corporate funds. If successful, charges could extend beyond workplace negligence to include financial crimes and falsified filings. The focus of the case had shifted from emotional testimony to hard evidence. Financial paper trails that juries rarely ignore. The narrative had evolved from a personal scandal to systemic misconduct, and the carefully curated image of the brand was now under intense legal scrutiny. Questions about accountability, corporate ethics, and the influence of high-profile figures dominated the courtroom. The tension escalated further when a former head of crisis communications took the stand. Her testimony dramatically widened the scope of the case. Under oath, she claimed that management had personally authorized the suppression of multiple workplace complaints over the company's final 2 years. These were not casual grievances. They included formal reports detailing safety violations, intimidation, and, in one instance, physical injury. The courtroom absorbed each revelation in stunned silence, as the evidence made it increasingly clear that what had begun as an isolated incident was in fact part of a larger, meticulously managed effort to protect the company's image at any cost instead of addressing internal complaints. The company's leadership allegedly decided that negative media coverage would be more damaging than any lawsuit. The strategy became one of silence and strict control over the narrative. Testimony from a former head of crisis communications revealed tactics that went far beyond standard PR management. Mental health records, confidential and unrelated to most workplace disputes, were reportedly accessed and analyzed in internal meetings to discredit potential whistleblowers. Names were attached to diagnoses, and talking points were carefully crafted to make employees appear unreliable. The line between protecting the company's image and ethical misconduct blurred, raising serious questions about legality and internal governance. Subpoenaed emails from the communications head's personal account shocked observers. In one, she wrote, "If the employee flips, we flip it back on her." Gaslight mode on. The language was calculated and cold, exposing an internal culture that not only feared exposure but actively planned for it. Other messages labeled the injured employee a financial liability, a PR risk, and an optics problem the company could not afford to address publicly. These were internal voices, not outside critics, revealing a level of strategic preemption rarely seen in corporate crisis management. Analysts speculated about witness tampering and potential obstruction, that leadership's direct involvement in shaping narratives around employees could itself constitute coercion, particularly if it discouraged others from speaking out. The boundary between public relations and legal interference had become dangerously blurred, and company executives' names appeared on nearly every internal memo. Emails also referenced key figures outside the immediate management team, with instructions to ensure that reports of the injury remained contained. Timing and tone suggested not only awareness of the incidents but tacit acceptance and coordination. The central question became clear: when does crisis management cross the line into deliberate, coordinated concealment? The combination of suppressed complaints, manipulated narratives, confidential medical records, and financial maneuvers painted a disturbing picture of intentional control to protect the brand at all costs. Text messages recovered from personal devices revealed calculated planning to manage and contain employee disclosures before they reached the public. Taken alone, these might seem like routine PR strategy, but alongside shell companies, hush payments, and altered hospital records, they suggested a deliberate effort to conceal misconduct. The court was left to determine whether the company's final months were about closing a business or systematically burying a scandal. Was the collapse a genuine business failure or a carefully orchestrated exit to avoid liability? Meanwhile, parallel legal proceedings were being prepared, focusing on financial misconduct, fraud, and misuse of corporate funds. If successful, charges could extend far beyond workplace disputes, potentially including tax violations and falsified filings. The case had shifted from emotional testimony to hard evidence, with prosecutors emphasizing paper trails and financial documentation that left juries little room for doubt. What had begun as an isolated workplace incident had now become a full-scale examination of systemic corporate deception, governance failure, and the lengths a high-profile enterprise might go to protect its image at any cost. Public humiliation can be devastating, but a detailed paper trail documenting questionable corporate decisions posed an even greater threat to the company's leadership. Courtroom tension escalated when the former head of crisis communications took the stand. Her testimony significantly expanded the scope of the case. Under oath, she stated that executives personally authorized the suppression of multiple workplace complaints over the company's final 2 years. These were not casual grievances, but formal HR reports detailing safety violations, intimidation, and, in one instance, physical injury. Instead of investigating these reports, leadership allegedly prioritized protecting the organization's public image, adopting a strategy of silence and strict narrative control designed to avoid media scrutiny. The revelations went far beyond standard PR practices. Confidential mental health records unrelated to most workplace disputes were reportedly accessed and analyzed to discredit whistleblowers. Names were attached to diagnoses and talking points were crafted to make employees appear untrustworthy. The communications head described it as optics over ethics. Such conduct was not only unethical but, depending on how the records were obtained, potentially illegal. Image management had begun to resemble targeted character assassination. Subpoenaed emails from the communications head's personal account reinforced this portrayal. One message read, "If the employee flips, we flip it back on her. Gaslight mode on, we flip it back on her. Gaslight mode on." The language was cold, calculated, and indicative of an internal culture designed to anticipate and neutralize exposure. Other messages labeled the injured employee a financial liability, APR risk, and an optics problem the company could not afford to engage. These were not outsider opinions but directives from the organization's closest allies, demonstrating a strategic, almost political approach to crisis management. The testimony also raised questions about potential witness tampering. Legal analysts debated whether leadership's active role in shaping narratives around employees could constitute obstruction. While no explicit payments were mentioned, the deliberate manipulation of public perception using confidential information could be seen as coercive pressure, discouraging others from speaking out. The line between PR and legal interference was increasingly blurred, with executives' names appearing on nearly every memo. The shock intensified when several emails referencing high-profile stakeholders surfaced. One message read, "Handled it. PR will keep the incident buried. No need to escalate." Sent less than 48 hours after the workplace injury, the note suggested not just awareness, but tacit acceptance. It also raised new questions. Who else was involved? And did anyone take steps to intervene? The emerging evidence painted a complex picture of coordinated narrative control, secrecy, and potential legal liability, with the company's top leadership at the center of a rapidly widening storm.